This week I'm so excited. We're here on the farm. Behind me you can see a soybean field, and I'm here on the farm with Farmer Todd. So I'm going to introduce him and he's going to show us around his farm. Let's go. All right, here's Farmer Todd.
Hi, how are you doing, kids? My name's Farmer Todd, and I'm just here to give you a little bit of a tour of our farm. We farm just grain and vegetables on our farm. We're not an animal farm, but we produce the food for the animals to eat on other farms. So we raise about 400 acres of corn, 300 acres of soybeans, 150 acres of oats, 150 acres of wheat, and then we grow about 70 acres of green beans for a local food processor that you can buy in the grocery store. Just for your information, an acre is roughly about the size of a football field. So altogether we're farming a little over 1,000 acres. So if you can picture the size of a football field, we're farming about 1,000 of those areas altogether. So we use a lot of different equipment on the farm. Right now I'm standing in front of a large tractor that we use to pull pieces of equipment that we use behind it. Just as a little bit of information, if you can see the number up here, it's an MX230, and tractors are based on the amount of what they call horsepower that they provide. So if you can imagine that this 230 horse tractor pulls the equivalent of 230 big draft horses, that's how powerful this one piece of equipment is compared to what people used to use 100 years ago when they were using horses for power. So we have everything from this huge tractor down to small old tractors that maybe we'll see later that are only maybe 12 horsepower. But this is typically what we use to pull all the equipment that we have on the farm, and we can attach things to the back of it and just use this as the power source so that we can pull things through the field, and they're interchangeable, so they can all be attached to the back of the tractor, and we can use the tractor for multiple different purposes, for all sorts of different equipment. So we'll just attach them to the drawbar here, or these 3-point hitch linkages, and we use this tractor then to pull that stuff through the field. So this is our corn planter and also our soybean planter. This is one of the implements or pieces of equipment that we pull behind the tractor. Right now it's in its transport position so that we can travel up and down the roads and not be too wide, but when I pull this piece of equipment in the field, it rotates around like a carousel at an amusement park, and it's about 30 feet wide once I pull into the field and rotate it. So we'd never be able to travel up and down the roads with this piece of equipment unless we could make it narrower for transport. But the gray boxes are where we store the seed that we're going to be putting into the ground. That's the seed hoppers. The white tanks are for liquid fertilizer, that we add fertilizer to the ground so that plants have nutrients that they need for growing. And then there's a whole system of moving the seed and the fertilizer to the rear area of the planter, where we have openers that put the seed under the ground into a furrow and then close it back up so the seed is ready to germinate and grow into whatever crop that we're planting. These are examples of 3 of the grains that we grow here on the farm. This first one is corn, and this is animal corn. It's not sweet corn. We don't grow corn on the farm for people to eat. Sweet corn is harvested when it's very young and the kernels are soft and delicious and very sweet. This corn is actually for animal feed, and it's very dry and it has a lot of nutrients in it for the animals, but you would never want to eat it. You wouldn't like the taste of it. It's very, very bland, and but we're able to harvest this with the combine and put it in the bin, and we can store it in this fashion for years if we need to, as long as we keep it dry and keep it keep things from getting into it. It can be stored for a long period of time. And this is actually called shelled corn because each one of these kernels has been shelled off of the cob. Just the way you see in sweet corn, animal corn has a cob, and we shell the corn kernels off of the cob and throw the cobs back in the field for fertilization for the, to build the soil. But we only save these kernels, and it's easier for us to transport and store when it's off the cob or off the ear. We don't. A long time ago, they used to harvest a lot of ear corn. They would harvest the whole ear in one piece and store it that way, but our efficiency is much higher if we're able to shell it, and we put it through a dryer if we need to dry it down so that it doesn't rot. And once we get that dry, we can store it in the bin for people to come and buy to feed their own animals. This is oats, and this is what you might find in Cheerios. They use oats. Our oats that we grow here goes primarily either for animal feed, or, as I told you before, we clean it and sell it for other people to grow. We can take this seed and replant it next year, and we can grow more oats so that we can sell it to other people for them to grow, and we can also clean up our own seed and grow it ourselves. So we can produce our own seed here on the farm, and we don't have to go buy seed because we can clean it up and plant it the next year. And you can continue to do that. And I showed you what a bushel was. We plant about 3 bushel per acre. So we put 3 of those tubs on a piece of ground the size of a football field, and those 3 tubs, when we harvest that football field acre of ground, that should produce 100 tubs. So we go from planting 3 tubs of oats to producing 100 tubs for each acre, and that's how we're able to produce more feed, more food, just by planting a small amount. And each plant has a lot of these seeds, so we get a lot more when we harvested it than what we planted. So we saw corn, we saw oats, and these are soybeans. These are little round BB looking seeds, and that's the seed that the soybean plant produces. You might have seen the soybean field and the plant that's growing this year. These soybeans were harvested last fall in October and stored in the bin, and these are what we sell to our customers for. They can be used for feeding animals. Their soybeans are being used for all different uses now. They can make biodiesel fuels out of them for trucks, using for fuel in trucks. They can use them in inks. They can make plastic materials out of them. And also they're very high in protein, so that when people are raising cows or chickens or hogs, pigs, they use a lot of this soybean ground into a meal to provide the protein that the animals need to survive. So that's what we use the soybeans for. This is actually a soybean plant. You can see behind me is the field of soybeans that we planted. They're in rows that are 15 inches apart, about this far apart, that we planted with the planter that I showed you earlier, the corn and soybean planter. This plant was actually put in the ground about 7 weeks ago. So it's got a decent amount of growth to it. You can see the root system. This is what I pulled out from the ground. This is below the ground, this part of the plant. It's actually got these little nodules on the roots, which it's called a legume. So it produces its own fertilizer. It takes nitrogen out of the air, and through these nodules on the roots, it's able to supply some of its own fertilizer needs, nutrient needs, through the process that these nodules go through. So we're able to take some of that nitrogen out of the air and use it for the plant, and that helps it stay green. But that plant is about 7 weeks old. So this is a soybean plant. This is a field of corn. This corn I planted in the beginning of May. So this has grown this high just from the beginning of May. This is the first couple days of July right now. So you can see a long time ago they used to say that they hoped that corn was knee high by the 4th of July. That doesn't really count anymore. We want it to be at least waist high or chest high. The varieties of corn that we're growing now are much better at getting a lot of growth in a short amount of time. If we have enough water and enough sunlight and enough nutrients, these plants will grow. They say you can almost hear them grow or see them grow overnight. This plant will actually, if it has enough nutrients and water, will end up being 10 or 12 feet tall, probably the height of a basketball hoop in a normal year. So it gets much taller than this, and eventually you'll see as you're driving along the road that it'll produce an ear. Each plant will put an ear on the side of the plant that's about maybe 10 inches long, and it has hundreds of those individual kernels on it, and that's the corn that we harvest in October and November in the fall. Also, after the plant has died down and dried up. There are a lot of farms that have animals can actually go along when the corn is still green earlier in the fall, in September. They'll go along and chop the entire plant into little pieces and feed the kernels of corn, the ears, and the entire plant. They can grind that and chop that almost like a salad fixer. They'll chop it into little pieces and put it in piles and in silos, and they'll feed the entire plant to their animals. That's called harvesting it for silage or forage. So I'm standing in front of a cornfield. Just one little interesting thing is that we're getting some really hot, dry weather. And if you look at this corn compared to the corn in the other field that you might have seen, this corn is starting to get damaged by the heat and the lack of rain. If you look at the difference, these leaves on this corn plant are starting to curl up. This plant will actually curl up and protect itself and try to preserve all of the moisture or the water in the plant that it can, so it doesn't breathe out that moisture and waste it. So these plants here are starting to show some stress, just like you feel when you go out on a 90-degree day and it's hot and sunny and you haven't had enough water. These plants are suffering from the same kind of temperatures and lack of moisture that you feel when you're out on a really hot day. People ask me a lot of times, do you plant the same thing every field all the time? And the answer to that would be no. Each year I plant a different crop in a particular field, and we call that a rotation. So this year there's corn in this field. Next year we'll probably plant soybeans in the field, and the following year might be oats, and then the following year might be wheat, and we call that a rotation. And that helps us to kind of not develop some weed problems that we might have. When you get really comfortable and used to things, the weeds are comfortable and used to it, and the weeds will thrive. When we throw them off by planting different crops at different times, we have problems with bugs eating the plants, but most bugs will only eat a particular kind of crop. So if every year we plant a different crop, they have to move around to try and find those different crops. They don't get set up in one place and become more and more of a problem every year. So I'm standing next to a field of oats, which is the green crop on my right, your left, and on this side is a field of wheat. So this wheat is starting to dry down. The plant is dying. It's going from, it was green, just like the oats field a couple weeks ago, and now it's starting to dry down, which is what we need it to do. We need it to dry down and die and have the kernels dry up and harden before we can harvest it. So this wheat is probably around a week away from being harvested. And on top of this wheat is what we call the head. So that's where the grain is at the top of the plant. And then the lower part of the plant is what ends up being the straw. All the leaves and the stem become the straw that we bale up into the bales that we put in the barn. But this head of wheat, each one of these little pieces is a kernel. And what the combine does is come along and it threshes, it's called threshing the grain out of the chaff. So it has a piece of the machine that rubs it together. We separate the wheat from the chaff, and we're left with the wheat kernels that we use to put in the truck to take to the bins to store. So if you've ever heard somebody saying that they're separating the wheat from the chaff, that means they're separating the good stuff from the junk. You don't want the chaff, you just want the wheat. And that's the grain that we're going to harvest in this field next week when it's ready. This oats has a little bit different shape to it. The kernels are on separate little stems or panicles. They're more spread out than the wheat head, but similar type of thing. This isn't close to being ready because it's still green, so it won't be harvested for a couple weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, until it'll also turn brown just like the wheat field does. But this is the oat seed right now. It's still green. That'll eventually turn brown. Has a little bit different shape and a little bit different size than the wheat kernel. It's a lighter grain. It's not as heavy when we harvest it. It's more fluffy. And this is the type of thing that you might find in Cheerios or other foods, that granola bars, things like that have oats in them. This is a kernel of oats, and that is a field of oats. So right now I'm standing in a field of green beans that I just planted a couple of years ago. These are actually called Blue Lake green beans, and we plant them and they're harvested by a company called Hanover Foods that has a local processing plant. So I'm in charge of getting them planted and getting them to grow, and then they will come in about 2 months and harvest the green beans off of these fields that you can actually go to the grocery store and find on your local grocery shelves. If you're buying green beans, you may be buying the beans that are produced on these fields locally here to State College and University Park. This is actually about 2 weeks of growth on this green bean plant. This whole white part that you see here was under the ground before I pulled it out. The seed was down here at the bottom, and the plant put a root down which broke off when I pulled it out, and then it put a sprout up and it grows toward the sunlight, and it eventually reached the surface of the ground. And you can see the difference between the white part where it was not getting sunlight and where it turns green. You'll hear someday about photosynthesis in class, where it uses the energy of the sun and the light, and with the nutrients and things, everything above ground is green. So this green bean field is planted at about 100,000 plants per acre and seeds per acre, and we're hoping to harvest anywhere from 6,000 pounds to 10,000 pounds of green beans off of each football-sized acre in this field. This field that you see behind me is actually about 50 acres altogether. If you can see all the rows going off into the distance until you get to the other fields, this is a 50-acre field, so it's roughly the size of 50 football fields all in one spot. This is one of our medium-sized tractors. It's equivalent to about 125 horses. This is a John Deere tractor, which is a common name that you might see. A lot of our other pieces of equipment are Case International tractors, which are red, and a lot of farm families have one or the other that they really prefer. They're a green family or a red family, and they're very loyal to their color of equipment. We're starting to diversify. I grew up as a red family, and I'm starting to gather some green stuff, so we have both colors here on the farm. This is our smallest tractor that we have on the farm. My grandfather purchased this tractor in 1939, At the time, this was a state-of-the-art piece of equipment that was vastly superior to the teams of horses that he was using at the time. So this tractor's been around our farm for probably about 80 years, 70 some years. And we still use it just about every day. We use it as a power source to run augers and to rake straw in the field, but this tractor is only about 15 horsepower compared to our larger tractors. Our largest tractor is about 230 horsepower, so this tractor would still be equivalent to a couple of large teams of horses at the time, and so it was a great thing that they used for all sorts of stuff at the time, and now we're still able to keep it around and keep it running and take care of it, and it's still being useful. So this is one of our storage areas. We try to keep our equipment inside, out of the weather, anytime that we're not using it. So we don't like it to be out in the rain and the snow. The equipment will get rusty and not work properly. So when we're not using the equipment, we store it here in what we call a pole shed, or an implement shed for keeping our equipment. So as we look around, we have a couple of large, what we call triaxle trucks for hauling the grain from the field back to our farm operation here. Keep them in. We have a combine over here in the corner that we're going to see one outside later. We actually have two of those combines on the farm that we run at the same time when we're harvesting. We've got some seed boxes where we're storing seed that we're going to be planting later, and just a lot of room inside where we pull things in at night, and when we're not using them, we store it so that we can protect our equipment. And when I was talking about the combine, I was talking about how the straw that we harvest comes out of the back of the combine in what we call a windrow, which is a fluffy pile of straw in a row, and we'll come along with this baler, and this is called the pickup. It actually picks the straw off the ground and takes it back into the baler, where it's forced over into what we call the chamber. And the chamber is where the straw is packed in very tightly, so you can get a large fluffy amount of straw packed into a very tight bale, so it's easier to store. And then the machine actually ties two strings around it to hold it together, ties a knot, and forces it out of the back of the chamber, where these belts grab the bale and actually launch or throw the bale back into a wagon that's trailing along behind the baler. This is actually the twine that we use to tie the bales up. It comes in balls that are 7,000 feet of string or twine, and each one of these balls of twine, and they're fed into the baler and through the knotter system automatically, so that it's tying the bales and tying knots and pushing them back and throwing them onto the wagon without me ever having to get out of the tractor, hopefully. This machine is called a combine or a harvester, and it's the machine that we use to harvest all of the grains on our farm. The reason they call it a combine is because a long time ago there were multiple processes that were used to do the same thing that this machine does in one process, so they called it a combine. It combines the cutting of the grain that we do. It goes along through the field, and this is an attachment that goes on the front for cutting the grain, and it then takes the grain back into the machine and threshes it, or it rubs the grain out of the crop and separates the grain from the chaff and the stems and the leaves, and then it comes out the back of the machine. The straw and the fodder comes out the back of the machine in a windrow, so that's the third process that it does, and that's why it's called a combine. We use this for harvesting wheat, oats, soybeans, and also corn. And the interesting thing about it is that this, as I said, this is a really wide head that goes on the front of the combine, but it's removable, so we're able to travel up and down the road by taking the head off, and narrowing down the machine so that it's safe to travel on the roads, and then reattaching the head when we get to the field. And we can also transform it into using a different head that we use for harvesting corn, which is planted in 30-inch rows, where a lot of the other smaller grains are planted in narrow rows. So this head actually cuts the entire crop off with these knife sections here. They almost act like they're a scissor. These are the stationary points, and these are the knives that actually cut the crop off just like scissors. And they take it back into the head, into this auger that I talked to you about before. The auger takes the material, the grain and the straw, into the center of the machine, and it's taken back in through the feeder house into where it's separated. What you're looking at right now is actually the cab where I sit to drive the combine. It has all the controls, and it's nice and air conditioned and comfortable and not dusty, so it's a nice place to sit while I'm harvesting. And that's where I drive the machine from, is the seat inside the cab. So the grain's taken up into the tank at the top of the machine, and as I'm harvesting, when the tank fills, I'm able to put an auger out to the side that you can see up here on the side of the machine. The auger rotates out to the side of the machine perpendicular, and I can transfer the grain, whether it's wheat or oats or soybeans or corn, any of those things that's in the tank, I can transfer it into one of our trucks and take it from the field and haul it into the farm where we store it in the bins that we keep our grain in. And then the back of the machine is where the straw comes out and is put in a windrow or a narrow row. You might drive along the road and see rows and rows of gold yellow straw in the field. That's placed there by the back end of the combine, where the straw is laid back out into the field, and then we'll come along later and bale up the straw into tight straw bales. This is the size of the tires that are on this machine. It enables us to go just about anywhere in any weather conditions, whether it's wet or rolling hills or... So here at the farm, we actually process and sell seed for other farmers to buy and plant the next year. So we process it, which means we clean the seed so that we get all the dirt and dust and everything out of it, and weeds and things like that. And we can process it into a bag, just like you'd go to the store and buy a bag of seed to plant the grass in your yard. We can process and clean wheat and oats to sell to other farmers for them to grow their crop from. And this is our cleaner, and it's actually from also the 1930s, about the same age as our smallest tractor. This is an almost all wooden seed cleaner that we put the grain in from up above. It runs down through the cleaner, takes all the impurities and stuff out that we don't want, and sends it back upstairs where we can bring it down and put it into bags and put it on pallets and sell pallets of seed to other farmers. So these are what we call grain bins. This is where we store the grain that we harvest on the farm. We're able to bring it in from the field, and we use something called an auger. You can actually see an auger laying there in front of the bin. This piece of equipment that we have here is actually called an auger, and this is called Auger Flighting. But this is the type of machine that we use to move grain just about everywhere on the farm. When we're filling the bins or on the combine, we use a lot of augers, and this rotates, and as it rotates inside this tube, it will actually move the grain from one end of the tube to the other. So we can put an auger up and move grain from the ground level all the way up to 30 or 40 feet in the air and fill these large grain bins. So this tub is roughly a bushel. If you can imagine that if this tub was full of corn, this would hold 1 bushel of corn. It weighs about 56 pounds for each bushel. So we could get 20,000 of these tubs in each of our large bins, and we have roughly a little bit over 100,000 bushel of grain storage on the farm, with including all the different bins. This is one of our large corn bins. So this one particular grain bin will hold about 20,000 bushel of corn. This is our barn where we store our straw. This is pretty much the oldest structure on the farm. It was probably built back in the 1800s originally, and then the original barn burned off, caught fire and burnt back in the 30s, and the barn was rebuilt on the same foundation that the original barn was sitting on. So this is where we store all the straw that I talked about. When we bale it in the field onto the wagons, we'll haul the wagons from the field into this barn, and then we use manual labor to stack the straw in the barn. We'll have 8 or 10 people here, and one person will pick up a bale and move it to the next person, and we can actually fill this barn all the way up to the peak of the roof, 30 feet high, just by each person throwing the bale up a couple layers at a time. So this is an actual bale of straw, which is what I talked to you about before that the baler makes. It packs a whole bunch of this straw, or the fodder, the plant material from the wheat and the oats, into a tight bale. It wraps these 2 pieces of string around it and ties a knot, and it makes it very portable so that we can sell these to people for mulching on their yards or bedding their animal pens or anything that they need for that kind of mulch material. One thing that we always hear is people think that this might be hay, and you can remember that the difference between hay and straw is that straw is usually yellow and it's a dead material, the plant has died, that is used for mulch. Hay is usually something that's harvested green, and it's to feed animals. You get the same kind of bale with the same kind of baler, but the hay is a grass or some type of alfalfa or clover that's baled into a bale, and then those bales are cut open and fed to animals for their food. So hay is green, straw is yellow or gold. Hay is used to eat, straw is used for mulching purposes, and all we do here on our farm is straw. We don't raise any hay here because we don't have any animals to feed it to, and we have enough going on that we never got into raising hay. But we bale roughly about 15,000 of these bales of straw every year and completely fill this barn and also another barn that we have with straw bales, and then people can come in and load them onto their trucks and buy them for whatever it is that they need them for. But this barn is almost empty right now. We're about 2 weeks away from harvest, and once we start harvesting, we'll start filling this barn back up, and it'll be completely full from the floor to the ceiling by the time we get done, and ready for sale to our customers.
I hope you all enjoyed our trip to the farm this week. Wow, did we learn a lot about how farmers plant food for animals and for us to eat as well. I hope you enjoyed the tractors and the combines and all of the equipment and things that we saw on Farmer Todd's farm. Thank you for a wonderful week, and we'll see you next week to learn about the weather. See you later.